Why don't we get started today? My name is Beth Lander, and I'm the Vice President of the Medical Heritage Library, as well as the Managing Director of the Philadelphia Area Consortium of Special Collections Libraries. On behalf of the MHL and its Board of Directors, I would like to welcome you to the second talk in our spring speaker series. For those unfamiliar with the Medical Heritage Library, we are a collaborative digitization and discovery organization committed to providing open access to the history of medicine and health resources. Beginning in 2009, the MHL has aspired to be a research-driven history of medicine and health community that serves a broad interdisciplinary constituency. Today's event, like all those in the speaker series, illustrates the rich ways the MHL corpus supports research. Before I introduce Rachael, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded. Second, if you have questions for the speaker, please enter them in the chat and they will be presented to Rachael as part of the Q&A. Third, we'd like to extend special thanks to the Harvard Medical School for co-hosting this event. And we would also like to extend our great thanks to Dr. Jaipreet for helping sponsor the series. Finally, stay tuned for an announcement regarding the third event in our spring speaker series. Now, I am very pleased to welcome Rachael Gillibrand, lecturer of history at I'm going to screw this up, Aberystwyth University. Rachael received her PhD from the University of Leeds in 2020. Her research focuses on the history of medicine and impairment in the later medieval and early modern periods. More specifically, however, she is concerned with the relationship between disability and technology in the 15th and 16th centuries, namely the ways in which pre-modern people designed, constructed, and used various assistive and medical technologies to augment the body in response to physical impairment. Her talk today is titled Ear Trumpets and Audiophones, A Summer in the Medical Heritage Library Archives. And I will now happily turn it over to Rachael.
Oh, thank you so much, Beth, and to the Medical Heritage Library more broadly for having me here today. I'm just going to share my screen, and if somebody could just let me know that that has worked properly, that would be fantastic.
And it works.
Smashing, perfect. So, as Beth has so kindly introduced, my name is Rachael, and I'm currently a lecturer at the University of Aberystwyth in Wales. So good afternoon to those of you who are in the States, and good evening to anyone who's joining us from the UK. Today then, I want to talk to you about the work that I undertook as the Medical Heritage Library's Jaipreet Virdi Fellow for Disability and Technology in the summer of 2021. So the purpose of this fellowship was to work with the Medical Heritage Library's digital collections to produce a series of primary source data sets relating to different kinds of disability technologies. As you can imagine then, given my research background in disability tech, I was absolutely thrilled when I was granted this fellowship and really excited to dig into the archives in search of new and interesting material. But the first question then was really where to start. So at my last check, the Medical Heritage Library had just shy of 340,000 items in their collection. And well, you know, there's only one of me. So I began by conducting really broad searches of the catalogue to see what kinds of disability technologies appeared in the collection. Of course, I found all sorts of exciting things, ranging from everything from a 2008 amendment to the Social Security Act, modifying accreditation and licensing for prosthetic devices, right through to designs for a Gouty chair dating from 1787, and of course, everything in between. And so based on this really broad range of material, I had to decide how to frame the primary source sets. I was left thinking, should I structure the sets around particular technologies, such as wheelchairs or prostheses, or should I be thematic and think, for example, about the relationship between war veterans and disability technology? So, well, seeing as the Medical Heritage Library had already produced a number of really brilliant primary source sets about disability from this more thematic perspective, these look at, for example, the relationship between disability and war veterans, disability policy, and disability interventions, and I'd absolutely certainly recommend taking a look at those if you get the time. I decided that I'd do something slightly different and go down the route of individual disability technologies. So for me, the term sort of quote disability technology or assistive aid conjures images of incredible robotic arm prostheses like the hero arm, the kinds of running blades that you might see used by amputee athletes, or the sort of motorized wheelchairs used by people like Stephen Hawkins. However, while creating primary source sets relating to artificial limbs or wheelchairs felt like an immediately obvious choice, I thought it would be more useful to create a series of primary source data sets that drew attention to the kinds of disabilities that are at once more ubiquitous within society and more frequently overlooked in the scholarship. As a result, I ended up creating 3 primary source sets, one on visual aids, one on hearing aids, and one on dental technology, all of which will be made publicly available online, so feel free to have a look at those. Anyway, that's enough, I think, for now about the purpose of the placement and the reasoning behind my construction of these particular source sets. What I'd actually like to get into then is to tell you about some of the really exciting things that I found whilst putting these source sets together. So let's start off then with visual aids, or more accurately, technologies to assist people living with sight loss. So according to the World Health Organization, at least 2.2 billion people around the world have some kind of visual impairment. And according to projections from the Vision Council, around 164 million adults wear spectacles in America alone. It's unsurprising then that I found lots of material in the Medical Heritage Library's archives relating to the production, prescription, and use of spectacles throughout time. However, that said, I'm not going to talk about spectacles at any length today. But if you are interested in knowing more, do have a look at my primary source collections, or even better, go and have a dig around the Medical Heritage Library's archives for yourselves. There's so much fascinating stuff there. Instead, what I want to tell you about in relationship to visual aids is something that I didn't expect to find in the archives, but that I found really incredibly interesting. And this is the way in which gramophone records and radio were adopted as a disability technology. So throughout the 1920s then, radio was increasingly adopted as a civilian commodity, despite its earlier origins as a military technology. Although the system of conveying the news and providing entertainment was not specifically designed with blind people in mind, radio rapidly became an indispensable disability technology for individuals with ocular impairments. And there are plenty of documents attesting to the fact in the Medical Heritage Library's archives. For example, the archives hold a 1929 Town Crier article titled "What Radio Means to the Blind," in which a Massachusetts woman is cited as saying that when she listens to the radio, quote, "I forget my blindness, forget everything, except that I'm one of the many thousands enjoying the great same pleasure," end quote. Similarly, in a 1922 Reader's Digest article titled "Radio for the Blind," Miss Leila Holterhoff of New York City is quoted as saying, "I believe that the radiophone will be the greatest single force in history in ameliorating the condition of the blind." However, I quickly found that radio faced one major challenge in becoming a widely used disability technology. It was very expensive to purchase a radio set, and an average radio set cost around $250, which by today's standards is around $4,100. So this is a huge amount of money for ordinary people. Some blind people, though, tried to avoid these high prices by building their own radio sets. For example, in an article from the November 1932 issue of Short Wavecraft, Dr. Robert Marks describes how he builds and operates his own radio transmitters. So after losing his sight at the age of 12, Dr. Marks went on to develop what he called radio fever. He explains that as a young man, the cost of his education and attending medical school left his finances too low to go out and buy a radio of his own. So instead, he built his own, which he states was, quote, "so remarkable that I could have sold it any number of times," end quote. However, radio was not the only audio technology developed for a consumer market in the early 20th century. Following the wake of radio's unintentional but undeniable success as a disability aid for blind individuals came talking books. So talking books were first conceived of by a man named Ian Fraser. Fraser had lost his sight after being shot at the Battle of the Somme, and despite having learnt Braille, was frustrated by how long it took him to read a book in this format. In 1918, he began working with the Royal National Institute of Blind People to find a solution to his problem. To begin with, Fraser tried to record books on gramophone records, but these could only hold up to sort of 5 minutes worth of content. By 1934, Fraser and his team had developed records which could play for up to 25 minutes per slide. And from this, the talking book, which is described in the Medical Heritage Library's collections as a 10 double-sided 12-inch gramophone disc, each side playing about 25 minutes, was created. However, much like radio sets, these talking books were often too expensive for people to buy. And as such, a series of talking book lending libraries emerged through which people could borrow these items at no cost. In 1937, the Literary Digest reported that 27 libraries across America offered a selection of 200 talking books. These books would be sent free to the borrower through the mail, and then, much like an ordinary library, the borrower would return the book upon completion. And again, if you're interested in seeing what kind of titles were available through this service, the Medical Heritage Library archives have digitalized copies of the talking book topics bulletins right through from 1936 to 1949. I really enjoyed looking through these lists because they demonstrate the real diversity of material that was available, ranging from things that you might expect, like the Bible or Shakespeare, right through to the works of people like Mark Twain or P.G. Wodehouse. As someone then who listens to a lot of audiobooks myself, I was delighted to learn about this technology's origin within disability technology. In 2021, it was reported that 46% of Americans over the age of 18 had listened to at least one audiobook in their lives. And yet, I think the early history of the talking book is so rarely discussed. So I hope that my first primary source set will, amongst other things, shed some light on this really fascinating history behind what is today a very popular form of media. So next up then, my second theme that I investigated was hearing aids. So when people discuss hearing aids today, I think it's quite likely that they're referring to the small electronic devices that sit either behind the ear or inside the opening of the ear. At the most basic level then, these hearing aids work by receiving sound through a microphone, converting this sound into a digital signal, amplifying the digital signal, and then playing that amplified signal back into the ear through a speaker. However, recent technological advances have allowed for artificial intelligence systems to be used in hearing technology to do things like balancing soundscapes to suit an individual's unique kind of hearing loss. Today's hearing aids are also frequently compatible with specialized apps, allowing people to adjust their settings for their particular locations or needs. However, while I do talk about the origins of these kinds of electrical hearing aids in my primary source sets, today I want to tell you about some of the ways in which people constructed hearing aids before the advent of things like electricity, apps, or artificial intelligence. The hearing, or ear trumpet, was one of the earliest devices designed for individuals with hearing impairments. Acting as an extension of the outer ear, hearing trumpets worked by capturing sound from a desired direction, whilst blocking out unwanted background noises. The earliest account I found of a hearing trumpet in the Medical Heritage Library's archives dates from a copy of Francis Bacon's Silva Silvarum, published in 1626. So Francis Bacon was an English statesman and scholar who argued that one should construct scientific knowledge based on observation and sensory experience. This sensory-based method of experimentation worked really well in the development of the hearing trumpet, as he states, quote, "Let it be tried for the help of hearing to make an instrument like a tunnel, the narrow part whereof may be the bigness of the hole in the ear, at the broader end much larger, like a bell at the skirts, and the length half a foot or more," end quote. However, unfortunately for Bacon, his innovative scientific methodologies did not serve him quite so well personally, as he died of pneumonia contracted while investigating the effect that snow had on preserving meat. Unfortunately, by the late 19th century, the hearing trumpet had fallen out of popularity with high-status women who thought that it looked unseemly and drew unnecessary attention to one's impairment. One book in the Medical Heritage Library's archives, Baroness Staff's My Lady's Dressing Room, which was published in 1892, speaks really well to this kind of anxiety, suggesting that ladies who are, quote, afflicted with a nervous form of deafness, end quote, ought to use a more graceful appliance than a hearing trumpet to assist with their hearing. This, quote, more graceful appliance, she argued, ought to be an acoustic fan. Designed to look like a folding hand fan, the acoustic fan was a rubber device that could be held behind the ear to amplify sound. As Staff explained, when a lady wished to, quote, listen, they have but to take the fan, open it, apply the rim to the upper jaw on the side of the defective ear, and bend sufficiently to give some tension to the bamboo sticks, end quote. Unfortunately, though, the acoustic fan, whilst being a more subtle technology, was also less effective than a hearing trumpet. So there were certainly pros and cons of these different kinds of technologies. However, in 1879, a new and, quote, sensational hearing aid called the audiophone was introduced amongst the social elites. This was patented by Richard Rhodes of the Rhodes and McClure Publishing Company, and was made of a sort of fan-shaped sheet of hard rubber attached to a handle. It worked by using a silken cord to bend the audiophone into a sort of diaphragm shape before inserting the fan into the mouth and holding it against the upper teeth. This allowed the sound waves to be transmitted through the fan into the upper jawbone and through to the inner ear. The tension of the cord could then be adjusted depending upon the requirements of the user and the nature of the sound being heard. I have a little bit of a cold, so I'm just going to have a quick drink. So one thing I particularly liked in the Medical Heritage Library's archives was a digitalized version of the Audiophones 1880 advertising brochure, which offers a range of customer testimonials expounding the benefits of this new technology. For example, one man who's a gentleman named E.F. Test states that their audiophone, quote, has created quite a sensation among my friends. It was comical to see a number of them fanning themselves with it under the impression it was simply a fan, and then in a few moments to see their astonishment when they heard me hearing with it just as well as I ever did, end quote. Similarly, another gentleman called Henry Mills claimed that after having been very deaf for 20 years, he, quote, procured an audiophone yesterday and can already hear quite well in ordinary conversation and except by a little practice be able to hear sermons, music, etc. without much difficulty, end quote. Of course, you know, we must take those with a slight pinch of salt, seeing as they are bound up in the advertising material for the audiophone itself. Not everyone, though, was sort of agreeing with these rave reviews. In 1881, Lawrence Turnbull published a book called Imperfect Hearing and the Hygiene of the Ear, where he cites a number of personal testimonies, which are altogether more negative than those promoted by Rhodes and McClure. For example, one gentleman, referred to just as IH, found that when using the audiophone, quote, he cannot hear unless the voice of the speaker is so elevated that all his private matters are made known to all around. He also objected to the shape, it being too conspicuous, even though it's in the form of a fan. Similarly, another customer who is just called Mrs. L, she is also called a lady of great refinement, claimed that she would not be seen with the thing in her mouth all the time. Instead, she found that for church lectures or for operas, she preferred a small pocket ear trumpet made of metal and covered in black velvet. So again, we come all the way around full circle to reusing the hearing trumpet. So there's so much more, like I say, in the primary source set, but hopefully that gives you a slight indication of some of the interesting and innovative hearing aids that cropped up in my research. For my final primary source set then, I decided to look at dental technology, but more specifically at dentures. So in 2020, a survey produced by MRA Simmons showed that approximately 41 million people living in the USA, out of an approximate 332 million surveyed, wore dentures, which makes up about 12% of the total population. However, tooth loss and decay resulting from the needs of dentures isn't a modern problem. Due to the expense of treatment and overall sort of lower standards of dental hygiene, the number of people who suffered from lost or decaying teeth used to be much higher than it is today. In fact, as early as 300 BC, Aristotle notes that, quote, figs, which are so soft and sweet, destroy the teeth because they, owing to their stickiness, penetrate into the gums, and because they are soft, insinuate themselves into the 30 spaces between the teeth. So this is a problem dating, right back to Aristotle and beyond. Despite this frequency, though, of tooth decay and tooth loss, these conditions aren't generally considered to be sort of quote unquote disabling by modern society. Most people are fortunate enough to have access to preventative measures like toothpaste and toothbrushes, as well as dental care when things go wrong. And as such, severe and untreated dental problems are something that few people tend to experience, or at least not in an ongoing chronic sense. However, in a time before easy access to dental care, these kinds of persistent dental problems resulted in a number of physical and social disabilities. The loss of a large number of teeth could, for example, lead to difficulties chewing and then subsequently eating, and could also lead to an element of social ostracization. In one document I found in the Medical Heritage Library's collection, dating from around 1797, Nicolas Dubois de Chaman, who was a pioneer in the construction of artificial teeth, explained that dental problems could also result in speech impediments. Dubois de Chaman also states that these speech impediments consist of words and syllables that are indistinctly pronounced and slurred or run into one another. When we think about dental problems then from this historical perspective, we can begin to see how dentures served as an important disability technology. Oh, I'm sorry. Today, dentures tend to be constructed from a number of materials, including acrylic resin and metal, due to the affordable, lightweight, and malleable nature of those kinds of materials. However, it was not until the 1930s that this kind of acrylic resin was first used in dentistry. So I began thinking, what were people using to construct dentures before this point? Well, perhaps the most popular material in the construction of early dentures was ivory, and more specifically, hippopotamus ivory. This was because hippopotamus ivory was denser and more hard-wearing than elephant or walrus ivory, making it much more useful for chewing on tough or hard foods. The Medical Heritage Library holds a copy of the official descriptive and illustrative catalogue of items featured at the Great Exhibition of 1851. The Great Exhibition, which was housed within the Crystal Palace in London, was designed by Prince Albert to showcase the industrial and cultural products of the world. In fact, as Queen Victoria wrote in her diary, the exhibition contained every conceivable invention. One of these inventions, entered into the exhibition by Switzerland, was a set of, quote, natural hippopotamus ivory teeth mounted in gold, which would have been quite a luxury, high status item. However, despite the sort of early popularity in the construction of dentures, hippopotamus ivory was still an organic material and had quite a tendency to stain, smell, and then ultimately rot. It was also quite difficult and dangerous to acquire hippopotamus tusks, as you can imagine. And so these kinds of ivory dentures would also have been very sort of rare and quite expensive to purchase. As a result then, dentists began experimenting with porcelain as a material for the construction of dentures. The first porcelain dentures were made by the French dentist Alexis Ducteau, who had grown tired of wearing his own hippopotamus teeth. However, Ducteau had a problem. Whenever he fired the porcelain to sort of set the material in shape, the teeth he'd constructed would shrink and would no longer fit the mouth. As such, he teamed up with Nicolas Dubois de Chaman, who I mentioned previously, to start to think about how to solve this problem of shrinkage. They did this together, and Dubois de Chaman subsequently secured a patent for the construction of porcelain teeth and went on to write his dissertation on artificial teeth in general, which sought to expose the defects and injurious consequences of all teeth made of animal substances. However, perhaps the most significant step in the production of dentures came with the invention of vulcanite. So vulcanite was a material produced by vulcanizing natural rubber with sulfur and was patented by a man called Charles Goodyear in 1864. As a quick aside, I'd also just like to take a moment to draw attention to the incredible collection of digitalized patents available within the Medical Heritage Library's archives. So I've already mentioned a number of patents that informed my research in this lecture. So I've mentioned Rhodes's patent for the audiophone, Du Bois de Chamont's patent for porcelain teeth, and now Goodyear's patent for vulcanite. However, the collection of patents within the collections is so rich in material for disability technology more broadly. In my early investigations into the archive, I found patents for all sorts of things, from improvements to crutches, to the construction of artificial limbs, for spectacle frames and cases, orthopedic shoes and electropathic socks, and my personal favourite patent from 1868 detailing the construction of artificial breasts for women who had undergone mastectomies. So there's all sorts of extra material that didn't make it into the primary source sets that is out there, and I would absolutely recommend having a look through the catalogue and investigating some of these wonderful things. But back to vulcanite. So as I was saying, vulcanite was a hard but flexible rubber that could be produced relatively cheaply. For the first time then, this material meant that dentures could be made available to a real broad range of people, and especially people from lower income backgrounds. Dentures no longer needed to be this kind of aspirational elite technology. However, the introduction of vulcanite was not entirely smooth sailing. Although Goodyear had discovered vulcanite in around 1839, it was a man called Dr. John A. Cummings who realised it could be used for the production of cheaper, better-fitting dentures. Cummings filed to patent his vulcanite dentures in 1855, but didn't receive his patent until 1864. Over this 9-year gap then, in which the patent was being sort of contested and processed, many other dentists cottoned on to the fact that vulcanite made an excellent material from which to create dentures, and they've been producing it and making dentures out of it without paying any kind of license. Goodyear and Cummings were sort of unhappy about this and wanted to receive money that they felt was due to them from their invention. And so, after finally receiving Cummings' patent, the two men teamed up to pursue litigation against any unlicensed practitioners who used the material. Other dentists, they stated, were more than welcome to use vulcanite, so long as they paid a $45 licensing fee, plus a royalty of £1 to £2.50, or $2.50 rather, per denture. And if you're interested in digging into this in more detail, the litigation documents from the Goodyear Dental Vulcanite Company can be found in the Medical Heritage Library archives. Of course, the dentists who'd been using this material free of charge for almost a decade were not impressed by this turn of events, and many refused to pay the fee. As such, a man called Josiah Bacon, who was the treasurer of the Goodyear Dental Vulcanite Company, was employed to track down any dentists who were or had previously used vulcanite illegally and to make them pay the money that they owed. One particular dentist, named Samuel Chalfont, had a number of run-ins with Bacon, resulting in a sort of threatened court trial. Chalfont was understandably unhappy about the fact that he might be taken to court and end up in prison as a result of his making dentures, fundamentally. And so just after 9 o'clock in the morning on Easter Sunday, 1879, Chalfont went to Bacon's hotel room with a loaded gun. He threatened Bacon and then accidentally, according to Chalfont, shot him dead. Chalfont then went on the run for a couple of days until he turned himself over to the police and explained that he'd killed Josiah Bacon over this dispute about vulcanite and the production of dentures. Chalfont was sentenced to 10 years in prison, where appropriately he became the prison dentist. He also, at other points, attempted to escape from prison, but that is a story for another day. So to round things up then, I think we're coming to just about past. I think a gunfight over dentures is an exciting and unexpected place to draw things to a close, but I think that's appropriate. I think exciting and unexpected can be used to sum up my findings in the Medical Heritage Library more broadly. As I've explained this afternoon, I was delighted to have the opportunity to dig into some of the more overlooked forms of disability technology, and in doing so, to learn about everything from the unexpected relationship between audiobooks and disability tech, and to why, hippopotamus dentures fell in and then out of fashion. I think that's just about all I have time for today. So I'd like to say thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. Stop sharing my screen for you there.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That was wonderful. And I'm endlessly surprised at what can be found in the collections that are available through the Internet Archive. Emily, do you want to negotiate any questions that folks may have posted in the chat?
There we go. I had a problem hitting the video button. We do have one question that came in. Someone was curious about any updates on locomotor disabilities and technology reflected in the collection.
Oh, absolutely. There's all kinds of material there, and it depends what kind of time period you're interested in as well. So when I was digging into the collections, it was a summer period, and there's like I said, so much material that I had to find or impose limits of some kind somewhere. So I started looking from about sort of 1600 to the sort of early 20th century. I stopped at around 1950, but there's so much material from the post-1950 period as well, the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, and the material that exists there that I just didn't even have the time or space to dig into. So yeah, I'm confident there's plenty of material. It's just not the direction I went in.
Great, thank you. Next question we've received: are there records, information, or perspectives from users of these technologies as they were being rolled out? Did disability organizations have any role in the testing and the rollout?
So it's a slightly difficult one, because a lot of the again, I've spoken about things from a broad time period here. So my experience is traditionally as a medievalist. I normally work on the period 1400 to 1600. So the Medical Heritage Library archives allowed me the chance to move a little bit further forward in time and think about the sort of 19th and 20th centuries. So if there's any 19th and 20th century historians out there, do feel free to correct me, because like I say, I'm first and foremost a medievalist. But what I got from the material that I was looking at was that the people who were using these technologies, their thoughts, their opinions, their experiences were usually mediated through medical texts. So they appeared in sort of doctors' notes talking about the kinds of technologies, or they appeared in brochures advertising the technologies, but the specific sort of first-person accounts, so you would expect things like diary entries or letters or those sorts of things, weren't in the archives as extensively as those more sort of traditionally medical documents. And in terms of disability organizations, again, I suppose it depends what you mean by disability organizations. But there's a really nice example with radio, for example. The American Association for the Blind did a lot of fundraising in the sort of 1920s and 30s, and they ended up sort of setting up a system by which you could apply for a free radio. They did a lot of distributing of radios to blind people for free, and I think they distributed around 300 in the end. So there was that involvement as well.
Thank you. Another question has come in. Prostheses were quite expensive and upper class targeted commodities. Have you come across any DIY prostheses, especially hearing aids, in the Medical Heritage Library collection or in your other research projects?
So in the In the medieval period, again, it's where I sort of specialize, you do come across this. You come across sort of DIY prostheses in the form of people, people making use of friends and family as a kind of prosthetic extension of themselves, or animals, being able to sort of ride animals as mounts, as well as using things like the built environment, talking about, leaning on posts or on walls, or having that as a way to act as a kind of static disability technology, as it were. Within the Medical Heritage Library's collection, the closest I came to find with this was there are a few patents that talk about making pre-existing technologies more comfortable, which I thought was deeply interesting. So there would be patents relating to crutches, for example, and it's like, how can we make this crutch more comfortable? And it'd be talking about wrapping things around the handle so that you're exerting pressure on something a little softer than a wooden handle. And the same thing for sort of shoes and orthopedic footwear as well. You'd have patents saying, how can we make the soles of these shoes more sort of bouncy to help with particular sort of feet conditions. So there was that element. But again, because those sort of personal narratives aren't there as frequently as the more sort of medical material, I didn't come across strictly firsthand kind of accounts of those sort of self-designed prostheses in the same way.
Thank you. Following up, given your background in an earlier period, how might the understanding of disability have changed? There is an argument in disability studies that disability, as we currently understand it, is a modern industrial invention. What have you seen?
Oh, thank you for this question. This is a fascinating question. I could talk on for a while. This is a problem that I come up with a lot, which is why I tend to focus on the Middle Ages traditionally, because there's this idea that without the need to go to work, and without the need to operate within an industrial environment, sort of disability, sort of dystroke ability, didn't necessarily exist. If you were a peasant in medieval society, you could probably get by, irrespective of what your impairment was, your sort of physical bodily impairment. And I found in my research this just isn't the case. I'm a big subscriber to the social model of disability. So this idea that disability is socially constructed and that the impairment is the thing that is happening to the body. And this sort of social construction of disability goes right back. We've got sort of people being disabled by the environments that they live in, but also the worldviews that they live in as well. In the Middle Ages, the sort of predominant Christian worldview in the West can be disabling for people when disability is constructed as something projected upon to sinners or this kind of thing. So that's certainly going on sort of pre-industrialization as well as post. But one thing I've really enjoyed looking through the collections is, whilst we certainly see change, we see development, we see new sort of technologies beginning to emerge as a result of discoveries like electricity and this kind of thing, there's also just a lot of continuity. People find things that works and like to stick with them. So with the hearing aids, for example, a lot of the early technologies operate on the premise of sort of cupping your hand around your ear. It's just extending the shape of the ear, whether that's through an acoustic fan, whether it's through an ear trumpet, or some of the other devices that I talk about in the primary source sets as well. It's all operating upon the same principles. And we see these principles extending back to the medieval period as well. Of course, then we get electronic devices, which changes things. But I just love to see that sense of continuity, that there is progression, but there's also, that sense of things remaining the same and people using what works.
That's fascinating. Thank you for sharing your take on that. And it was a great question. Someone has written any favorite resources or authors on medieval or early modern disability that you would recommend?
Oh, there's so many people doing so many excellent things. The sort of the core of the debate really was Irina Metzler's book, Disability in the Middle Ages, which was published in 2006. And that was what sort of jump-started the debate, really. Prior to this, there hadn't been a monograph dedicated specifically to disability and specifically to the Middle Ages at the same time. People had generally sort of thought about the Middle Ages and disability as part of sort of lingerie approaches to disability, but not specifically on its own. So I definitely recommend Metzler as that kind of seminal text. But there's so much more. Christina Richardson has written a fabulous book on disability in medieval Islam, which is fantastic because, again, there's not a lot of work out there on medieval disability in the East. A lot of people focus on the West, so that's fantastic to see. Her work's brilliant. And all sorts of bits and pieces. There's great things all around. So yeah, let me know, drop me a message on Twitter if you want some more recommendations. I could reel them off. I won't bore you with book titles forever, but I'm on Twitter if you want to chat about it further.
Do you have any fun findings you'd like to tell us about that didn't necessarily fit into your presentation?
Ooh, what else came up? I mean, all sorts of things came up. I found some sort of clippings that I thought were fascinating about a domestic abuse case about a man who had been beating his wife, and it had been deemed a sort of a miracle because he'd stopped after he'd received dentures, which I thought was fantastic. Apparently his excuse for domestic abuse had been that he was in so much dental pain that he couldn't control himself, and that an unexpected consequence of him getting dentures was that he stopped that behavior. So there are a few interesting things like that along the way. Some of the patents were fascinating. Like I say, one of the ones that I was impressed with was thinking about Victorian mastectomies and the Victorian sort of silhouette and how prostheses were developed to support women who'd been through that process back in the Victorian period. I thought was incredibly impressive. I didn't get a chance to talk about them today, but there's a huge amount of material in the archives about guide dogs in the 1930s, which I really enjoyed. There's whole reams of documents about how guide dogs were chosen and trained and paired up with their future owners, and sort of Dorothy Eustace, who set up the Guide Dog Foundation for the Blind. Her autobiography is available in the collection, and how she sort of delved into that. So lots and lots of material on guide dogs. I didn't have the chance today to talk about material about the Victorian anxieties over swallowing your dentures. There were a few medical tracts on what to do if someone swallows their false teeth and how to remove them. Mostly people were okay. I think I came across one fatality as a result of swallowing dentures, but a number of cases where they were successfully removed or passed. But there's all sorts of things in there. If you can, if you can think it and search for it, there's almost certainly likely to be something there. Coming right up to the 1950s as well, because there are video records in the archives as well. It's not just text and documents. There's also video clips. There's a fantastic video clip from 1950 of the Volkswagen workshop, and how it was adapted for workers in the aftermath of the war who had various sort of physical impairments, and how they had a sort of rehabilitation centre attached to the car workshop, which I also found super interesting. So yeah, plenty of stuff.
And someone had just thanked you. They said that was pretty amazing. One other thing, and it's while we're waiting for any additional questions to come on, there's such a wealth of information that sometimes the first thing I tend to think of, well, you're an expert in the field. What is missing? If we think about content development in the future, obviously there's a Western bias in the collection just by virtue of the organization. That's something that we're working, to change. Other than that, I mean, were you surprised that something wasn't there, or anyway, I wonder if you could speak to perhaps gaps in the collection, and so that we can acknowledge that as well.
Yeah, so usually I am a sort of visual culture and material culture historian. So I care a lot about the lived experience of sort of quote unquote ordinary people in the Middle Ages. So people who weren't your kings and your queens and your nobles and your knights and then these kinds of people. But of course, in the period I look at, that group of people is often illiterate. They're not leaving behind those textual records. So when I'm constructing my own histories, I'm usually focused on thinking about things like, how can we make use of images? How can we make use of objects in order to bring to life these lived experiences of lower status people who've not necessarily left behind those textual documents. So for me, the one thing that I noticed that was a sort of gap in the collection was that more sort of visual source material, especially in a period where photography is, taking off, and thinking about whether there are particular photographic collections, whether there are artistic renderings of people with impairments from this period. So I think, you can tell a lot about, I don't know, how people responded to these different technologies, how comfortable people felt with them in their willingness or unwillingness, as it may be, to be depicted with them, and the way in which, I know there's a lot of satire from this period of elderly people using hearing trumpets, for example, and it's seen to be uncouth, and it's used as a sort of form of satire to show that sort of like poor behavior. So seeing more of that, more of the sort of medicalized satire or photographic collections would be lovely.
Thank you. So somebody said, machinist and railroad worker journals are a good source for information about limb prostheses. Have you seen anything on denture or hearing aids?
I presume in regard to railroad workers or machinists, maybe?
I think that they're saying that there's sort of industry specific journals or publications. So there might have been railroad worker or machinists. And so obviously in that line of work, the people are, so I think the question is, are there similar occupational journals that show up in the MHL that would have things either related to dentures or hearing aids or maybe other prostheses in a different kind of field?
Oh, I see. So not that I found, but again, it wasn't something that I was first and foremost looking for, so it could well be there. Go and sort of dig in and see what you can find. But one sort of occupational journal adjacent thing was military documents. There was a lot of sort of post-First and post-Second World War public-facing military documents, sort of by public, I mean like by intended for soldiers and their families, rather than sort of management levels, talking about various innovations. And occasionally within those sort of Army and Navy bulletins, you would get little sections about innovations in various sort of prosthetic technologies. So sometimes that would be about sort of limb prostheses, sort of arms and legs, but you also had maxillofacial prostheses as well. So for people who were suffering from wounds to the face, sort of the advances in those early facial prostheses occasionally get mentioned in those Army and Navy journals. So similar, but not quite the same thing. But yeah, absolutely, I'd recommend having a look.
We don't have any additional questions. Beth has a question. Prosthetic development often goes hand in hand with war. Did medieval early modern warfare generate similar developments?
Oh, absolutely. So that's it now. We're stuck here till for another half an hour. One of my favorite examples from the Middle Ages is a knight called Götz von Berlichingen, and he was a German mercenary knight. And he's the only example I've found so far of both an individual who suffers limb loss and who writes an autobiography detailing the account of their limb loss, and whose prosthetic limbs also survive. So we've got this sort of holy trinity of evidence for Götz. We've got these three things. In his autobiography, then, he explains how he lost an arm in a battle, and how he replaced this with a prosthetic limb. And what's really interesting is that we don't really see these mechanized medieval prosthetic limbs until around the sort of 15th century, and then they sort of become more and more sort of complex as time goes on. But the technology did exist, the technology that's being used in these prosthetic limbs, and we're talking about fully mechanized sort of clockwork hands, really. They're not just carved wood, they are metal, they're hollow, and they've got these clockwork sort of cog and latch mechanisms within them so that you can move the fingers. The understanding of these mechanisms existed long before the 15th century. We see these same mechanisms in automata dating right back to the sort of 10th century, 9th century in sort of medieval Islamic textbooks and sources. So it was definitely there, and it does filter through to the West. However, it wasn't until this point that knights were suffering these kinds of injuries that would sort of blow off arms and legs to the same degree, because we've got the advent of gunpowder on the battlefield around this time. So we see more sort of significant levels of limb loss. But we also see developments in treating limb loss as well, so that people weren't just bleeding out, and people weren't just cauterizing wounds, which could lead to shock and ultimately death through shock, if not through blood loss. We have people like Ambrose Paré, who was a military surgeon who was using ligatures to tie up arteries and veins in sort of lost limbs or amputated limbs. So these people were surviving, these people lost limbs, but they were surviving, and they were going on to continue in their professions as knights or soldiers or whatever. And as a result, then, we see this earlier technology associated with automata being repurposed, whatever it might be, 300-400 years later after its initial sort of appearance in the record, to make these mechanized prosthetic hands for people who survived the limb loss and then needed a form of substitute. So that's my favorite example from my period, but yeah, there's certainly that connection between warfare and medical and prosthetic development.
And I thank you for your response to my question. And you're right, it is something that I could like poke questions at another half an hour easily. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for our second session in our speaker series. I'd particularly like to thank Rachael for her wonderful speech and for her wonderful promotion of the Medical Heritage Library content. You can find the Medical Heritage Library corpus available on Internet Archive. Invite your and your discovery. And I would like you all to keep paying attention to our Twitter feed, where you will learn about upcoming events in this series. Again, my thanks to Rachael, to Dr. Jaipreet for helping us host this series, for sponsoring it, and to Harvard University for providing our technical resources, and to Emily for being the co-host for today's event. I wish you all a very happy and safe weekend.